Hello everyone, welcome to Rainbow Infinity. Today I'll be reading NorrisThePony's Days of Silence. If you like the reading, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Please enjoy. A still and soft defiance. Hot, but not too hot. The trick was to get the water right upon the precipice of boiling, when the first few bubbles began to creep from the flooring of cast iron, and begin their rapid descent on some ingrained desire to be one with the air above. Too long spent boiling, and the leaves would join the boil, their flavors muted and mundane. Too cool, and the flavors would scarcely separate at all, and at best he would have a pot filled with tepid and vaguely leafy-tasting water. Silverbrook peered at the fire he was gently nursing, prodding it with a stick held in his cloven hoof, and hoping the idle chatter of the forest around him was enough to mute the flame's insistent crackles. It wasn't that fire was forbidden in the Peaks of Peril. It couldn't be, after all. They still had to cook their foods and burn their torches. Yet it was a carefully controlled thing, something trusted in specific circumstances, to specific kirin, and certainly not the idle experimentation of a young kirin, not even into his adolescence. Still, the village wasn't always the best at enforcing rules. They existed in a translucent state, enforced not through laws and discipline, but by sidelong glances, the turning of heads. To ignore the transparent rules was, at least for a time, to become transparent yourself, as far as the tribe were concerned. Silverhead called it the silence of presence. He thought it was a good term, even if it were one confined to the reaches of his own head. Then again, that was where all thoughts lay, really. Not even just his own. Every living thing, vocal or not. He wondered, sometimes, if the noise of the birds suggested a lack of thoughts, or an overabundance of them. He added another stick to the smoldering flame, and reached his forearm over the fire, judging the way its heat splashed across his fur from afar. Deeming it to be appropriate, he hooked his forehoof around the cast-iron teapot, carrying it onto the crackling flame, and nestling it upon a pair of particularly balanced logs. He turned, reaching towards the satchel he had carried with him into the private little sanctuary he'd found for himself in the woods. Today, oolong. Much of it he had picked himself, in the surrounding woods. Some of it he'd climbed the mountains to find, his cloven hooves sending rocks skittering off some perilous precipice to the bottom of the rollicking valleys of home. And some still he'd simply found a moment's walk from the village, miraculously untrodden by uncaring kirin or by the wildlife that surrounded them. Near the center of the clearing, he had laid out several lengthy sheets of palm leaves. He had discreetly plucked some from the fences on the outskirts of the village, desiring the way they had grown larger and wider than the ones closer to the ground, and himself being too short to fetch the higher growths himself. Staring longingly at them, while his kin milled about and looked at him with tilted heads and curiously apathetic looks, hadn't brought them down for him to exploit. Upon the palm leaves, his teas had laid bleaching in the sun for days. He'd been graced with a lengthy stretch of rainless days, and it had been good to feel something close to anticipation, as he'd watched them slowly wilt to their desired perfection. He'd raced the sun to the clearing to lay them out, and measure its descent each day to retrieve them, and ensure they had not been plundered by avian or rodent greed. The older kirin would watch him arrive back in the village, with that same thoughtless curiosity, and Silver would make games wondering what thoughts lay imprisoned in their heads. He wondered if he'd be like them when he grew older. He knew, from the way the other kirin foals and fillies looked at their older kin, that they wondered the same things. Would passion and drive and interest continue to erode, as it had with them? Would he awake one day and realize he cared not how his leaves were doing, how they might taste, how many had flowered upon the peaks, as his snout picked up the traces of dewdrops pattering off leaves, and his hooves left his home to the spongy surface of a forest soaked in last night's rain, and his ears ignoring the approaching hoofbeats of his mother, pursuing him with umbrella or raincoat in tow? It didn't matter. He had greater focuses at the moment. He nudged his snout into his saddlebag, and withdrew his mortar and pestle. With it, he took a moment to examine the other contents he'd scoured, from the curious equine passengers of trains passing the peaks, between someplace important and someplace more important. Their calls sometimes staccato, strange, abrupt, and other times drawling and low and rumbling, as if they had found a way to conjure the distant thunder rumbling from the blackened sky and dragged across the corridors and mountain silhouettes. Many had carried the same sorts of objects, with their appearances and sizes differing slightly. They were the objects Silver coveted: thin, white leaf-like sheets, bound tightly together, and contained by a tight binding to ensure they did not slip away and remained in sequence. Squiggled shapes adorning nearly every surface of the sheets, though sometimes, if he was fortunate, they would also feature illustrations. Scenes in time presented without context, at least to Silver. The ponies, when they had offered them, had made the same sound to describe them. It was a sound like a single moment of a babbling brook, suspended in time and isolated from the rest of the eternal drawl. His oolong leaves are carefully crushed. The kirin used a mortar and pestle to reduce them in size, while strengthening their potency. Already he could feel how their scent rose to his nostrils and intertwined itself within. His lips tugged. If he could have smiled. He removes the teapot. The water has reached that critical moment when the boiling bubbles begin to hasten, but not yet roll amongst themselves. He sprinkled in his leaves, and adds a trace amount of honey to sweeten them, watching intently as the amber liquid swirled around the leaves, entwining them like the desires of a hungry snake. As the tea steeps, Silver lays back. Above him, the skyward realm passes, on its own separate path from the world beneath it. The trees rustled and shuddered upon some breeze, and Silver wondered if they, too, are lying static and suspended and spinning within a nest of their own imprisoned thoughts. He thinks about how spry and green and wild the young trees could be, how they bobbed and weaved excitedly in the heavy winds of autumn, while their older kin remained still and resolute and uncaring, having weathered enough to know that nothing changes, truly, and every storm ends to a quiet morning and a dawn chorus to fill a void they themselves could not. Eventually, he pours himself a mug, using a meshed filter to separate the oolong so carefully prepared for this one indulgence, just to be discarded now that its purpose has been met. He brings the mug to his maw and takes a ginger sip, and even if he had the ability to describe the warmth it gave him inside, he knew he would lack the words to do so. Thank you for listening in. I hope you enjoyed the reading. Until next time, stay tuned.